I think this is right where we quit. Go to the second to last page. You shouldn't have a map anymore. Find the universe of battle. Universe of battle. Civil War. Should have the positive good theory on the front. Positive good theory. Yes, it's right. Why? We're just getting started. We're just going to start today, so we have to tomorrow. I think we're only going to answer like 1 or 2 questions. We didn't quite get to the cause. It's my fault. We would have normally showed the cause, but I kind of lost a week when I had COVID and I missed that week. So I'm kind of playing catch up. And so we're going to. Oh, homework. So due on Wednesday, if you look at the last, turn the thing over there to Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address is, it's an amazing speech. Or not what he says. I really like what he says, but the big thing is how he can say so much in just a few words. That's the whole speech. It's tiny. And so there are 5 questions below that. Now for the first 5 or 6. For the first 4, I just want a phrase, just 1 or 2 words to answer. I'm just setting up the right, just so you went through it. So like number 1, just say what's up. Just a couple things now. But then for number 5, answer like short ID. It has to be on a separate sheet of paper. Obviously, there's not enough room, but I'm sure ID this will be on Wednesday. Okay, so let's go ahead then, and I'll remind you again tomorrow. Let's did we get the rivers? Yes. We got Fredericksburg, Burnside. Burnside's going to get fired soon after. We'll come back. But 1862 is that key year because the war has gone from Union to the Emancipation Proclamation. And so I'm going to have to go. We'll move through this pretty fast. Did we have Farragut taking New Orleans or did we not get to that? So on blockade duty down here. So Union forces are moving here by kind of by default. Because there are all these different Union forces around here. The most important one, what a guy named Ulysses S. Grant. Before we get to Grant, down here, blockade duty under U.S. Admiral David Farragut. Farragut was a Virginian who stayed loyal to the country. He had an ocean-going steamboat, wooden hull, and Farragut, basically, as admiral on the spot, Farragut, Commodore, I guess is the better way to put it, he made a decision that he knew there weren't hardly any Confederate troops around New Orleans. In fact, there were 2 old Union forts down here on either side of the river, but this is as flat could be down there. He was all bayous, it's flat. And so the forts are right on the river line. And he thought, if I could chug past these forts in the middle of the night, there's nothing in New Orleans and I can take it. And he did it. And they wrapped their anchor chains around the wooden hulls of the ships and chugged past, and it worked better than anyone could have thought. They went past these forts, and now there's no Confederate forces. And the forts had to be abandoned. And I actually went down there, and you could see why. When I was there, the Confederate fort on the east side was completely flooded and gone now. And the fort on the west side, the walls were still there, but inside was flooded. So you can see it was just right on the water line. And so they got up to New Orleans, and they sailed up and basically told New Orleans, surrender, we'll set the city on fire. And New Orleans surrendered, and just as McClellan is moving towards Richmond, New Orleans fell. And it was like, wow, when the war is over, the most important city in the Confederacy, at least commercially, fell. Early 1862. And southern Louisiana is going to be in the hands of the United States for the rest of the war. A massive victory. So what they would do in 1862 is they would take cannonballs, and they had stoves on board the ship for this very purpose. They would put the cannonballs using a tong and put them in and superheat them till they were red hot. And then they would fire those, and if it hits wood, they'll catch them on fire. That's how they did it in 1862. New Orleans fell, Boom. And Benjamin Butler, the same one who did the contrabands, would take command. And so now, coming the other way from the north, Union forces by default, it's under Ulysses S. Grant. I'll tell you I got his name later, because that's not his real name. Grant was a West Point, graduated, left the army out of boredom. He had the reputation of being a drunkard. It's a little bit unfair, but also fair. When he was bored, he drank. And I should add, he's not an alcoholic like you might think an alcoholic is. Alcoholic, you think of somebody who drinks all the time. That's not Grant. Grant could go days, months without ever touching alcohol. If he was doing something, or big thing is if he was wrong with his wife. If he's with his wife, he was okay. But when he would get bored, he would go on, they called it a bender, where he would literally drink for like 3 or 4 days straight, no sleep, just drink and get blackout drunk. And that was his problem. So that's a different form of alcoholism, he just couldn't stop. And so but he had that reputation from the old army. He didn't like this picture because he thought it made him look like a pirate. So he always would have his beard trimmed after that. Remember I told you generals were such a big deal to have portraits of? One more thing, Harper's Magazine did etchings of them. These were really big. They have full side in newspaper. People would tack those up on their walls. So when Grant won his first victory, they quick got a picture of Grant. That's who they would say is Grant. To this day, nobody knows who that is. Just some guy. So that's the first one they saw of Grant. That always kind of makes me laugh. Grant, with a newly built Navy, some gunboats, river boats, they're going to have to take 2 forts on the Tennessee and the Cumberland. These 2 forts, and both rivers run really close to each other. This is now a national park. Right here. Fort Henry on the Tennessee and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. And Grant sailed upriver on gunboats. The admiral, the commodore was a guy named Porter, eventually be an admiral. As they chugged upriver, as they got to the fort, it was really popular to have pictures like they're looking down. That became a big style. And they have these of Helena. There's a couple of restaurants I know have these, where they're kind of looking down. I have one at Helena. I think they're really cool. There's all kinds of places. It's really popular style. This is looking down, and you can see it here. In the spring runoff, Henry flooded. And so they took the fort without firing a shot, because all the gunpowder flooded. And all of a sudden, Grant won this huge victory. Then they had to cross over and take Fort Donelson. Donelson was a much better fortified position. It was up on a hill, as this picture shows it a little bit. They tried to take it by storm and failed, and then they laid siege. The Confederates didn't have much food inside the fort, and so they were going to have to surrender. There's no way they could hold out. The commander there, a guy named Buckner, sent word out to Grant. They knew each other from the old army, saying, "We will surrender, but we have terms or conditions. No more fighting, we'll end the bloodshed, you get the fort, we'll stack our arms so we don't keep our weapons, and then you'll parole us. Let us go back home." And it was a way to stop the fighting without any unnecessary bloodshed. Really calm. So conditions or terms. Grant responded rather curtly with, "I will accept nothing but unconditional surrender," which they would surrender unconditionally, and he would parole. But the reason why this is so important, as at a time when McClellan and Union generals seemed so cautious, Grant seemed like he was a fighter. And Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, unconditional surrender Grant. And he would get this reputation as a hard-nosed fighter. It was deserved, even though he could be a very creative, a fine general who did a couple of his operations would be pretty incredible. But that's those 2 rivers fell. And with that, in one fell swoop, when these 2 forts fell, and this fort fell here, Union gunboats could go up and down these rivers. And the Confederates had to evacuate all of Western Tennessee. They had to evacuate Memphis and Nashville without firing a shot. And for the rest of the war, this is going to be in Union hands. What a massive victory. And so you have McClellan advancing towards Richmond, New Orleans falling, and all of Western Tennessee. It really did seem like it was over. There was talk, what do we do about those who betrayed the country? Will they be hung for treason? They started talking about that. And so with these fall, Grant reinforced over 40,000 men, slowly went down to Tennessee, and they really thought it's over. I mean, the war is done. They couldn't put any pickets out because the Confederates were nowhere to be found. And by the time they got to Shiloh, there's a little place called Shiloh Church, Pittsburgh Landing, Shiloh Creek, right here. Hills, lots of a forested area, really pretty area of southern Tennessee. They didn't even put out guards. I mean, it's over. And Grant, the rumor was he was drunk or drinking, again, went on a bender. Probably not, but he was becoming very lackadaisical. But the Confederates had organized every man they could find down here. And they were organizing a counterattack that totally took them by surprise. A 2-day battle. Sometimes you see it called Pittsburgh Landing, but today everyone calls it Shiloh. April 6th and 7th. And just a horrible battle. Over 80,000 men would fight in this battle. Casualties are pretty even, but nearly 1 out of every 4 men to fight in this battle would be killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. As a percentage of people killed, one of the bloodiest battles in American history. So this happened, just as McClellan is going this way, Farragut takes this, and then right here shot. All these things at the same time. And the Confederate commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, we don't need to know him. They had a very elaborate battle plan. Beauregard from Sumter was there too. And they've been marching all day on the 5th, all night of the 6th. Men got lost. And so they didn't stop to have breakfast. They just marched and were exhausted. But it worked, at least at first, just like the plan was, at least the attack was. They attacked just as the sun was coming up, and complacent Union forces were sitting around their campfires cooking breakfast. And as they're sitting there cooking breakfast, a very weird thing happened just as they're lighting the fires. All of a sudden, rabbit, deer, and other forest animals started running past them. Why would all these animals be running past them? Because 40,000 men were pushing all the animals. And then out of the woods, screaming the rebel yell, came 40,000 Confederates and took them to the US. We're not 100% sure what the rebel yell actually sounded. It was a high-pitched yip sound, appears to be as close as we could get. Union forces were known for yelling huzzah, hurrah, cheer. Confederates, this kind of like, yip, yip. But we'll do that the last 8 minutes. All screaming as loud as we can. That'll be half your word. I think people will appreciate it, don't you think? Don't you think other classes would? Okay, so Union forces, a few little bits stopped and popped. Most of them just took off running. The only thing that saved them that morning is starving Confederates stopped and started eating their breakfast. They got their food and they started eating. And so the Confederates got all tangled up because of the mountains, elaborate battle plan, men got lost, they stopped and ate. So a few pockets of Union forces held out. And that would slow up the Confederate drive until Grant could recover and organize. One of these places right here, about 800 Union soldiers held out until they finally surrendered it. This is a picture of it here and here, called the Hornet's Nest, where they said the mini balls, the musket balls, whizzed by them so fast they could hear them. They said it was like he hit a hornet's nest with a stick. And they held out just long enough to where Grant could organize his men, begin organizing a defense force. At that moment, the Confederate commander, Johnston, was mortally wounded. And in that, the chaos to try to find Beauregard to take over. And with that, Union forces held, just barely. The next day, a few reinforcements arrived, and Grant's men pushed the Confederates off the battlefield. 1 out of every 4 men killed or wounded, a bloody, horrible battle. Almost Confederate victory. And this is what why it's going to be the most important Confederate battle to many people after the war, looking back. Almost. We're going to turn the tide. Took back Tennessee. Who knows? Almost. We'll come back to Grant in just 1 second. But this is an almost victory. And so of all the battlefields of the Civil War, Gettysburg is the best known. Most people go to Gettysburg. And then second, Manassas, because of its location near Washington, D.C. right here. But actually, Shiloh a lot of times is the second most visited battlefield. And this is what start happening 20, 30 years after the war. And they called it the lost cause, where they would go back and like, we almost had a shot. This was the battle we could have won. This was it. This is the battle. And so this is going to become a really important battle to this day for those in the Confederate Army, or those who dreamed of the Confederacy coming back again. To this day, they go there. And so this is about 17 years ago, 18 years ago. Years start floating together. But over spring break, and spring break that year was just at the end of March, first week of April, my wife and I flew down to New Orleans. Went to New Orleans for about 4 or 5 days, and then drove up to Natchez, Vicksburg, Memphis, and then Cheyenne. And that's a really great spring break trip. And like New Orleans was felt really hot to me at that time. And people there were saying, "How can you be hot? It's only 85." But did that trip, and we actually went to Shiloh, went back to Memphis, went back to Shiloh, because when we were there, we didn't even think about it. But April 6th, people were going to be still going to be in Memphis. So we decided to go back to Shiloh because they're going to have an anniversary for them. We heard they said it's going to be thousands of people are going to be there. They're going to have over 15,000 reenactors. They set up a field outside so they could reenact it, because again, can't be on the battlefield, that's hollowed ground. And there are going to be thousands of people there. They're going to have exhibitions, they're going to have bands. I mean, it's just going to be this big deal. We said, well, let's go. That sounds really neat. And so we went there, we watched the reenactors, reenactors are really funny. They get into it. They try to act like they're still 1862. So you have most of them are middle-aged guys trying to act like they're 20-year-olds. It was a lot of fun. But we saw them, but it's also a little bit weird too. And then we went into the battlefield itself. There's so many people there. It's a huge battlefield. And this massive parking lot. It's like I told you, it's one of the most popular battlefields, one of the most popular tourist destinations in the United States, certainly the South. There's no place to park inside. We parked about 4 miles away and then had to shuttle bus in. And this, think about a battlefield about the size of hell. That's how big it is. It's so spread out. But we had to take this in, and there was just that many people there. Thousands of people. We got in there and they're doing things like they're firing off cannon with black powder with half charges. Has anyone ever fired or been by somebody firing a black powder musket? Yeah, it's so loud, so much louder than modern or a current rifle that they would smoke this powder, which is really loud. Don't get me wrong. Black powder, when you notice it, it's loud. Think about a cannon, even with a half charge. I went up to go take a picture of it. This would be a great picture. I walked out. I wasn't ready. Fired, and felt it. It was just all they did just fire the gunfire. They didn't fire a cannonball or cut it not down. No, they fired. They just knocked me down. It was so loud. And then one of the guys fired it. I told you so. He didn't tell me anything. Okay, but anyways, I got. They had a hospital set up. It was really pretty amazing. And there were thousands of people there, and they had this little podium or a little bandstand set up, and they had this little band of his guitar, fiddle, and they're playing civil war music. And there were a good 1,000 people watching. Just all these people listening to it. And so we went and stopped. We listened to them. We're maybe 50 yards away from it. That's how many people. We're saying this massive crowd. Now we've been in New Orleans, we've been in Memphis, we've gone all the way up. And I don't know if you know this, but it's a lot more diversified in, let's say, much of the rest of the United States. And we throw a place out, Helena or Montana. And I find that amazing and refreshing. I love that going there. But you're there, and so you're in New Orleans or Memphis, there are people, white people, there are black people, they're all just all over. It's just that's the way it is. It's America. Well, at Shiloh was totally different. And while listening to the band, my wife and I were sitting there, or listening, standing there, and we looked around, and it's the first time since the week we have been there, and there was nobody who was running. And that's not the way Memphis, that's not the way it is there. Just that's not. And so it's like, well, battlefield, but all. And also, something else. It was a really warm day. In fact, I was in shorts and a t-shirt, but everyone had t-shirts on. And I would say almost every t-shirt people wearing had some form of a Confederate battle flag. In fact, person in front of me had a Confederate battle flag, and it said, "We have not forgotten," right in front of me. And that's the first time looked at that, it's like, okay, this is fine, they can take that, but it's like everybody. And, we're not at Gettysburg, that's for sure. So Sanders listened, the band got done with the song, and then was applauding. And the guy said, okay, so we're here to remember one of the most important battles of the Civil War. And everybody started to boo. People are boo. Boo? And then I just wasn't thinking about it. It was just so shocking. Then he said, no, we're here to remember, no, what I meant to say was the war between the states. And everybody started to cheer. This is interesting. And then they said, no, we mean the war of northern aggression. And people started putting their arms up and cheering. Yes, yes. And then he said, no, I mean the war of northern arrogance. And people were hugging and chanting. And it was, like, wow. And the whole mood just got changed. And my wife grabbed me and she said, I feel like we're the enemy. And this is not the United States. It felt very interesting to me. And so it felt just overnight. This is weird. And I remember I was told this, and I read it was like this. And so think about, I'm standing there watching, and I turned around, and I'm kind of looking back at this. And we're going to go to something else. And you ever get that feeling like there's just a presence of somebody very close to you? You ever had that feeling like also for somebody right there? I'm walking back, and I could feel it. And I turned around, and there were 3 men right in front of me. And they were all standing there like this, looking at me. And they're all about this tall, so I'm like standing over them. And it just happened to be like right there. And they looked mad. And I didn't even think, it was so shocking to me. Oh, there they were. And the guy looked at me and said, you a Yankee? And what? It was just totally out of the blue. He said, no, are you a Yankee? And so my first thought is, I'm gonna have to fight these 3 guys. But my second thought, I just thought, I'm from Montana. It just came out from Montana. And then you can just see like the guys, no idea. He's like, Montana? Canada? I don't know. And he said, no, are you a Yankee? And I said, Montana wasn't a state. It just came out. And I remember thinking, like, what am I gonna do? And he just looked at me and walked away. And so that was, and I think, okay, why me? Well, I didn't even think about this. So I was wearing clothes. And I wear these t-shirts. I wear these t-shirts. I like these things of these old minor league baseball teams, minor league football teams. These old ones from the 30s and 40s of old teams, like, various things. I like the old logos. I think they're really cool. I like that. And so I was wearing an old NFL team. And this was one that was from the 1940s. And so today there's a team called the Arizona Cardinals. They used to be the St. Louis Cardinals. Before that, they were Chicago Cardinals. So it's Chicago Cardinals had the old Cardinal logo. I didn't even think about it. I just grabbed a shirt because it was a nice day. And then it dawned on me, no, I'm wearing a shirt from the North. So I was a Yankee. And that's why they found me. And so that's when I realized that for many people, the Civil War was not over. That's my Shiloh story. I would still highly recommend going there, but just be forewarned if you happen to be there on April 6th or 7th. And I've talked to my wife about this because I've been to Gettysburg 3 times and I want to go back. I just really like that. Antietam, I just think amazing. And she said, and I said, I really want to go back to Vicksburg. And she said, yeah. I said, well, maybe Shiloh. No, we're not going to Shiloh. She, nope, we're not going. You're not going. So I probably won't go there. So with that, Grant, though, was blamed for being taken by surprise. But they couldn't fire Grant because of unconditional surrender. And so they made him second in command and brought the northern or the western division commander, Henry Halleck, to take command. And the second command does nothing. Halleck is one of the most important generals in American history, and no one knows him. He was called Old Brains. He was a protege of Old Fuss and Feathers, kind of makes sense. Another incredibly cautious general. And so instead of aggressively fighting for the rest of the summer, not much happened. And that allowed Confederates to kind of coalesce and organize. But after Antietam, Lincoln realized me in command was a disaster. So Halleck was brought to Washington, D.C. and given overall command of the entire United States Army. Henry Halleck. So the highest ranking general in the United States. So Grant's back in command. And there's the most important city now, all focus. In fact, the entire focus of the war turned to Vicksburg's on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. And the Confederates turned that into a mighty fortification. Any boats going in the Mississippi, cannon would plunge down. It was rugged all the way around, so it's going to be really hard to attack. If you go there, it's actually kind of startling. These big valleys go like this. You have to go up and down to finally get up to Vicksburg, kind of up like this. And so it's a great fortified area. And here's the Yazoo Delta region. And so it's all swampy, and these are all bayous over here. So it's almost impossible to attack. As long as the Confederates hold Vicksburg, they hold the Mississippi. And the Confederacy is still unified. And so this became the most important symbolic town, Vicksburg. Everything about Vicksburg. And now Grant had to take it. They tried overland this way, because it was going to be so hard to attack right here. But overland, their supply lines got too long. And that means every railroad bridge would be vulnerable to cavalry. And the Confederates had two great cavalry leaders, including maybe the greatest cavalry leader in American history. All fall and winter of 1862, Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalry defeated bigger Union forces and ran rings around Grant's men, where Grant had no choice but to pull back. The supply line he couldn't hold. Forrest was a just natural, brilliant Confederate or brilliant cavalry leader, maybe the greatest ever in American history, at least. And he was also a truly horrible man who got rich as part of was a middleman to funnel slaves on the long, horrific forced marches downriver. He was a slave trader, got rich that way. After the war, he became a symbol of Confederate resistance and became the first. They called him a grand wizard, this group called the Ku Klux Klan. We'll get to it. We're not done with Nathan Bedford Forrest. And just because somebody is really good at something doesn't mean they're a good person, or for that matter, good at anything else. But he was just a natural cavalry commander. So now they had to find all kinds of different ways. They tried to go through here. They tried to go through the swamp. They tried 8 different ways to try to get on Vicksburg, and all of them failed. Here is a picture of Vicksburg. This is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers from 1863. And the river went south, then turned north, and then right back south into this little finger of land. It meandered so much there. The cliffs here and the fortified line, it's just a perfect fort, an amazing fort. And so any boats had to go here, chug here, and they could almost come to a dead stop. Confederate guns here just plunged right there. And so the only real dry land was down here. They couldn't get there. They even tried to cut a canal and let water flow through so they could skip past. Almost 11,000 men would spend 3 months trying to dig a canal. They made less than a mile. You might think, well, how could they only do less than a mile? Think about winter, raining all the time, sandy soil. Think about every time you shovel with sandy, wet soil. What happened? Shovel, throw it up, slide back down. Yeah, so here's a picture of the canal, building it, but it went almost nowhere. I should add, the canal's still there. It's about 18 feet wide. It's about 3/4 of a mile long. And it's the water the color of root beer. And it's just as straight as an arrow, 3/4 of a mile, 18 foot wide. It's connected to nothing. It's just there, full of water. So I had to go see it. And I went there and it's like, God, this is so weird. And when I went there, there was some guy sitting on the pier fishing for carp. I asked him, what are you fishing for? Carp. And then, of course, Jack, what are you using for bait? corn and cheese. Okay. And it's heavy cotton. He opened up his cooler and there were more carp. Has anyone ever eaten carp? Smoke it. The bones, I guess, dissolve. They just eat the whole thing. I had carp once in the South. It tasted like you would think carp would taste like. But all of them failed. But then finally, going in 1863, Grant came up with a brilliant plan. As the waters began to recede, they would march on the Louisiana side and get south of here. And then in the middle of the night, the gunboats, they didn't put any steam up, so they're just going to float past the guns on the new moon. So it's pitch black, and hope they could slip by. They were hoping half of the ships would make it up to 38 that wind. Only 2 were sunk. It worked better than anyone thought. They got past the Confederate guns, ferried Union troops over at a town called Bruinsburg. They went to a place called Hard Times, right there. I've been to Hard Times. It's an appropriate name. But instead of attacking right here, they advanced overland, defeated any Confederate chance that hit them in the rear, then pushed all the Confederates towards Vicksburg. They were cut off the supply line, so they lived off the land and just stole from Southern farmers. And it worked, a brilliant plan. And by May, they tried to take Vicksburg by storm. It failed, and they settled into the siege of Vicksburg to start with. And it worked brilliantly. Grant surrounded it, but the problem was inside Vicksburg, there were 30,000 Confederate forces, and the civilians of Vicksburg held out and held out. And soon all anyone could talk about was Vicksburg. And so that's what happened by the West by 1863. Now, in the East, let's get back to them at 1863 now. Burnside's fired. And he'd be replaced in the East. Burnside is gone. The Army of the Potomac would be under the command of Joe Hooker. And Joe Hooker was a good chef. He didn't like the name fighting. It was actually a typographical error that led to the term fighting Joe Hooker. But he built the army up again. He had the aura of like McClellan. He would do grand reviews. Here he is on his very big horse. And the men felt better about themselves after the disaster of Burnside. He got better food for them. And he began to wait till the spring runoff to go down and to attack. And so it's going to 1863. And Hooker came up with a really good plan. One more thing I should add. I've heard this from other people have told me. Sometimes my students tell me. Taking his last name. There's a certain thing that might be named the same thing. It has nothing to do with fighting Joe Hooker. You know what I'm talking about. It has nothing to do with him. So with that, we're coming to the Battle of Chancellorsville. So just as Grant is beginning the amazing operation to surround Vicksburg, Hooker came up with his plan. And what we're going to do right here is take this. And so with that, and Vicksburg, no, Chancellorsville. And so they came up with a really good plan, but I got to draw it. I got to draw it. Leave the screen up, it's such a pain, but I'm going to draw this. So I'm going to take you on a trip to Northern Virginia. Are you excited? I haven't done a map for a while. So here is the Rappahannock River. Rappahannock, isn't that a great name for a child? We got Chapultepec, we got Rappahannock, we got Ticonderoga. I give and I give. Here's the Rapidian River. Here's an area of forest here. This it's green. It's called the Wilderness. Yes, that's the actual name. And what happened was, right here is Fredericksburg. Hooker's armies encamped there, over 120,000 men. It's been reinforced. Lee has barely 50,000 men. He had to send nearly 20,000 men down to North Carolina to forage for food. That's how short of supplies they were. Lee just didn't think that the Union Army would do anything for another 2 or 3 weeks. So he is outnumbered. Hooker came up with a really good plan. He would send part of his army and they would actually cross downriver. They'd even cross the river to convince Lee a major attack's coming here. And then the night of the 30th, he had all his men light campfires, the remaining men. And over 80,000 men then, in the middle of the night, marched around in 2 columns through the forest and stole a march on Lee by a full day. In fact, the plan was to get here, dig trenches, and now go to Fredericksburg now, have the Confederates attack him. And it's a good plan. And so they got through here. Lee, once he heard about it, does what Lee always did. He took the nearest men here, about 10,000 men, and they just counterattacked, just attacked. Best they could. He didn't have enough he knew to stop him, but he just wanted to just do something to slow him up. And Hooker panicked. Hooker, instead of getting out of the forest where you couldn't see anything, he had his men line up here along the river. And you notice how the line just kind of ends right here. And wait in the forest. And because it's so heavily forested in the hills, he couldn't see Lee maneuver. And now Lee realized he has a golden opportunity. He had his men march all the way around, 30,000 men, 2/3 of his army under Stonewall Jackson, march all the way around and hit this flank. Here were the worst men in the Union Army. It's called the 9th Corps, the 11th Corps, and they were known as the Dutchmen. And the nativists, remember nativists? Their attitude in the army was these were inferior fighters. They couldn't speak English very well. They don't know how to fight. Whoop, they're the worst soldiers in the army. And if you tell somebody they're the worst, just like people go up to your expectations, they drop. I should add Dutch. What country would they be from? Good guess, but no, very good guess. Dutch, Deutsch. They're Germans. So they call them Dutchmen. And Germans, I don't know if you know this, and looking ahead in the story, they are pretty good fighters. But anyways, they're here looking this way. They can hear firing over there, but they couldn't see it. And they thought they were totally out of it. They have been just ignored. They didn't prepare anything. They were sitting there watching. And then this is on the 3rd. All of a sudden, same thing like Shiloh. Rabbits start running by, deer, snakes. All these animals started pushing this way. And like, oh, look at the animals. And then the few scouts here came running out of the woods full speed, just running full speed. And they had enough time to yell, here they come, probably German, and they keep running. And I just imagine they just kind of, huh? And here come 30,000 Confederates screaming the rebel yell out of the forest. And it was a disaster. This whole side of the line just disappeared. Just a scramble. I mean, think about it. If you're standing here and all of a sudden 10,000 or 1,000 men come running at you, what are you going to do? Stop! No, they took off running too. And it was just a madhouse. The only thing, oh, and then a shell exploded near Hooker and he was concussed. The only thing that saved the Union from total defeat. Okay, good. The only thing that saved them total defeat, it got dark. It got dark. And so with that, and then Stonewall Jackson rode out in the middle of the night, or just at sundown, I'm sorry, to go check the Union line to attack the next morning. As he rode back, Confederate pickets saw a shadowy figure and opened fire. Stonewall Jackson was hit right here, but it nipped the bone. And if you nip a bone in 1863, what do you got to do? Amputate as quickly as possible. The problem is it was so close to the shoulder blade, the socket, they couldn't cut it very hard because the bone splinters up and down the bone. And so they cut off the bone. Maybe somebody will tell you how they did it. I'll make fun day before lunch. But they thought they saved it. And by day 2, he seemed to be doing better. And then it's in Stonewall Jackson. Hooker was able to pull his army back, but Lee won his greatest victory, but at a horrible cost. There'd be over 30,000 casualties, 16,000 of them would be Confederates. They're running out of men. And so, with that, just gonna start universal battle, because that sets it up exactly where universal battle is. We started today, we're gonna watch it all day tomorrow and a little bit of it on Thursday. Sound good? Maybe? So this is from a series called The Civil War. It's a great series. It's one, it was made in the late 1980s. It's still considered the prototypical documentary. It's 10 parts. Universal.